Today we're going to talk about Unit 2 and the cranial and facial bones. Here's a picture of the skull. These are the three of the four cranial bones: the frontal bone, the parietal bone, and the occipital bone. Notice the sutures and some of the bony landmarks. Here's the location of the frontal suture, the sagittal suture, and the lambdoid suture. Notice here is the lambdoid at the intersection of the occipital and parietal bone. Here's the bregma at the intersection of the frontal and parietal bone. Here in dark blue is the occipital bone. Some of the bony landmarks are the lambdoid suture, which we saw in the previous slide, and the external occipital protuberance. On a posterior view of the occipital bone, you can see the foramen magnum, which is the foramen that the spinal cord travels through, the jugular foramen, which is the foramen that the jugular vein travels through, also the cerebellar fossa or the posterior fossa, and the hypoglossal canal that the hypoglossal nerve travels through, and the external occipital protuberance. Now here's the temporal bone. Notice the zygomatic process of the temporal bone that articulates with the zygomatic process. Here you can see both the squamous and mastoid parts of the temporal bone. The opening of the external acoustic meatus is located here, the mastoid process and the styloid process. Here's the sagittal section of the temporal bone, and you can see the opening of the internal acoustic meatus. This is the pterion, and you can see this is the region where the frontal and the temporal bone are at a junction. Here are the facial bones. You can see the nasal, the maxilla, the mandible, the zygomatic, the lacrimal, the ethmoid, and the sphenoid. On this slide, we have some of the bony landmarks. Please remember that the frontal bone is a cranial bone and not a facial bone. Here's the nasal bone with the intranasal suture. Here's the maxillary bone with the intermaxillary suture. Here's the mandible with the mental foramen that the mental nerve travels through. Here is the zygomatic bone, and you can see the zygomatic maxillary suture. You can see the perpendicular plate, which actually comes down off of the sphenoid bone, and the vomer, which is part of the nasal bone. The lacrimal bone, and you can also see the intraorbital foramen on the maxilla. This is the orbit and the bones that compose the orbit: the lacrimal, the ethmoid, the sphenoid, the frontal, the zygomatic, and the maxillary.